I don't know if I'm still alive, because for the past 11 days I've been trapped in this motel room. I don't sleep, I only close my eyes, and every night at exactly 3 a.m., that sound comes from inside the wall. Drip, drip, drip. And that's when I realized, whatever I was running from, it came with me. My name is Daniel Ashmore. I worked a remote IT job, so no one cared where I was working from. After saving for a few years, I decided to buy my own house. At first, I was looking around the city, but strangely, I kept feeling drawn to isolated, forest-surrounded places. Like I wanted to get away from the crowd, far away from everything. Then one Thursday, I found the listing for the house at Voss Lake, a house deep in the forests of Kentucky. 12 acres of woodland, on all sides, a private lake. Small, quiet, completely set apart. Just looking at the pictures, I felt it. Like the place had been waiting for someone for a long time. And the price? Just $94,000. Looking back now, I understand. There was a reason it was so cheap. The price was $94,000. I read it 3 times. Because you shouldn't be able to find a place like that for so little. 12 acres of land, a house by the lake, good condition. Something had to be wrong. The next day I called the agent, Brenda Halsey. On the phone she seemed strangely eager. She told me the house had been sitting on the market for 7 months. No one wanted it because the location was too remote. The nearest town was nearly 40 minutes away. It all sounded reasonable, but I didn't quite believe it. I asked about the previous owner, Gerald Voss. The man had apparently lived alone in that house for over 30 years. He died last winter, a natural death. But when Brenda talked about him, something was in her voice, like she was choosing her words very carefully. When I asked if there had been any problems with the house, she was quiet for a few seconds, then simply said, "The house is fine. It's just been empty for a long time." 2 weeks later, I drove out to see the place myself. The final stretch of road went through the forest, so remote that for the last 20 minutes, I hadn't seen a single house. No mailboxes, no driveways. Nothing. Just the road and trees on either side. It felt like I was slowly entering a part of the world where people weren't supposed to be. Around a bend in the road, the house appeared. It stood in a small clearing in the middle of the forest, as if the trees had deliberately stepped back to make room for it. The house was old, but not falling apart. One side of the porch sagged slightly, and the windows looked odd. Even in the daylight, they were so dark it seemed like someone was looking out from inside. I know that sounds like an exaggeration, but the first time I stood in front of that house, I genuinely felt the place was calling me and warning me at the same time. Brenda walked me through the inside. The house was mostly empty, but a few things remained. A wooden coat rack by the door, a heavy table in the kitchen, and metal shelving bolted to the basement wall. Inside the house, there was the smell of dust, old wood, and a faint chemical odor. Everything seemed surprisingly fine. New roof, good wiring, dry basement. There was only a small crack on the east-facing wall. Brenda said it was normal. Then I wanted to see the lake. We walked through the tall grass behind the house down to the water's edge. Voss Lake wasn't very large, but the water was so dark that even in midday sunlight you couldn't see the bottom. Forest on all sides. No road, no houses, no sound. I didn't understand that. The place was so quiet because something else made sounds there. For the first 9 days, I didn't see a single person. On the 10th day, I drove into Black Hollow, a tiny town, to get groceries. The town was so quiet it seemed like everyone locked their doors before dark. The elderly woman behind the counter at the store paused for a few seconds when she heard I was staying at the Voss house. Then she asked, "You're staying there alone?" I said yes. As I was leaving, she called me back. "Is the cell reception decent out there?" I said, "Not really." The woman slowly shook her head, then said, "Get a landline installed. You might need it." I didn't ask what for. Looking back now, I should have. The first strange thing happened on October 14th. I'd been in the house just over 2 weeks. It was nearly 11:30 at night. I was lying in bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Like old houses do, this one made various sounds at night. The creak of wood, muffled sounds inside the walls, whine through the gaps in the trees. But this sound was different. Suddenly, a thudding noise came from below. Knock. Completely clear. From the basement, I lay still and silent. A few seconds of nothing. Then again, knock. Louder this time, like someone beneath the floor was striking it with their fist. I told myself it was the pipes. Old houses do this. Then I pulled the blanket and rolled over. Sleep was almost coming, and then the sound returned. But this time not once, 3 times. Knock, knock, knock. Equal intervals, as if something was counting. That night I didn't go down to the basement. I told myself I'd check in the morning. But the truth was, lying in the dark, I suddenly had the feeling something down there was awake. And it knew I was up here. The next morning I opened the heavy wooden door beside the kitchen and went down to the basement. The stairs were old wood, each step creaking. Below was a large empty room. Concrete walls, low ceiling, metal shelving on one side, and gray light seeping through a small window. Everything looked normal, except one thing. In the middle of the floor, on the dust, were 3 circular marks, as if someone from below had slowly struck 3 times. After coming down to the basement, at first everything seemed fine. Dry floor, intact walls, nothing unusual anywhere. I checked the pipes, water heater, breaker panel, all of it. Nothing turned up. But then I noticed something. Beneath the shelf unit, scratch marks in the concrete, old, covered in dust, semicircular in shape. It looked as if something heavy had been dragged out at some point, then forced back into place. I tried to move the shelf. It didn't budge at all. Bolted to the wall with 4 heavy bolts. But oddly, those bolts looked newer than the shelf itself. I told myself maybe I was overthinking things. For the next few days, nothing happened. I almost forgot the whole thing. But on October 19th, I decided to walk through the forest. The trees were dense, light breaking through the leaves in patches. About a quarter mile in, I found a broken down shed. Roof collapsed, walls rotted. Inside was a rusted saw, a chain, and a glass jar. The jar was still intact. Inside it, a folded piece of paper. I opened it. Pencil writing, the handwriting shaking. If you find this, I'm sorry. I tried to stop it. The bolts are in place. Never move the basement shelf. Don't go under. And if you hear the knocking, don't answer. It's counting how many are listening. No name, no date, nothing. I pocketed the paper and walked back to the house. I told myself this was probably just the fear of someone who lived alone, the way your mind works after years of solitude. But from then on, I started avoiding the basement. I'd walk quickly past the door. One day I caught myself, standing at the door with my ear pressed against it. Nothing. Just a low hum from inside the old house. Then on the night of October 22nd, the sound started again after 2 a.m. Knock. 1, then silence. Then 2, then 3, then 4, 5, 6, 7, growing by 1 each time with a long silence between. It was counting. After 7, it stopped. But the silence was the worst part, because then I understood clearly. It hadn't finished. It had only paused, waiting for my answer. I didn't respond. I didn't knock back. I lay in bed and waited until dawn came. Gray light crept in through the crack in the curtains. Then I got up and made coffee, sat at the kitchen table staring at the basement door, trying to figure out what was I going to do now. At this point in the story, you need to understand something about me. I don't believe in the supernatural. Never have. I studied computer science, spent my whole career fixing systems, finding problems, tracing causes, explaining everything with logic. So that's what I did. I started looking into things. That afternoon, I went back to the store in Black Hollow. Ruth was at the counter. I bought a few things, then very casually asked about Gerald Voss. She paused for a moment. Her hands slowed. "Why do you ask about him?" I said, "I found some old things in the house, wanted to know what kind of man he was." Ruth said, "He kept to himself, came into town once a week, didn't talk much." I asked, "Did he ever mention anything strange? Sounds or—" She cut me off. Her voice went slightly firm. "Gerald Voss was a private man," she said. "He lived alone for many years. It's best if you make the place your own and don't think too much about his life." "Why?" She looked at me then. Really looked, and I saw that same thing again. The same look that had been in Brenda's eyes. Something surfaces for half a second, then disappears. "Because some things don't need explaining," she said. "You just have to stay away from them." I left the store with even more questions. Outside by the parking bench, an old man was sitting. Thin, elderly, wearing a worn John Deere cap. He raised his hand and called to me. "You the one who bought the Voss place?" I stopped. "Yes." The man slowly nodded, like he'd expected this answer. "Can you still hear it?" Something inside me went cold. "Hear what?" The man was silent for a second, then said, "The counting." I could feel my expression changing, because he gave a slight bow of his head, like he felt a little sorry for me. "Gerald used to come here sometimes," he said. "Late at night, when the town was almost dead, he'd sit on this bench, an hour of complete silence. Then he'd leave. One time, I saw him sitting here at 3 in the morning. I was listening, but growing more uneasy by the second. I asked him why he was there so late. Know what he said?" I shook my head. He said, "Because it knows I'm here, and every night it moves one step closer to finishing its count." I stopped. "What count?" The man took off his cap and rubbed his head. I asked the same question. He only said the number of sounds a person makes when they're alone, and when it finishes, the door opens. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with October cold. "What door?" I asked. He paused for a moment, then said slowly. He didn't say. But after that, Gerald started bolting everything in his house. Heavy bolts. He ordered them from Lexington. He was keeping something fixed to the wall in the basement. What? He never said. I thanked him and left, back in the car, driving the twisting forest road back toward the house. The trees now seemed bigger, closer, bending over the road. I pulled over, stared at the house, and was deciding, what would I do now? Logic said this was a story, a local legend, something built from a lonely man's fear. But another part, which I'd been deliberately ignoring, was reminding me, you didn't answer. Still, it didn't stop, and it ended at 7. That's when I decided I'd document everything. If there was any pattern, I'd find it. If there was a cause, I'd trace it. And that very night I heard the first recording, which was not a pipe, not wood, not wind, a voice, counting. I paused for a moment after reading that line. Abnormal acoustic characteristics. At first it didn't seem like a big deal, a technical phrase like something in a report. But sitting in that kitchen with the basement door behind me, and still hearing the echo of that breathing in my memory, it no longer felt ordinary. It felt like a clue. Like something had been started here long before, even before Gerald Voss. I began reading again slowly. The echo, the shaft depth not matching the sound, all of it started swirling in my head. Sound never breaks the rules, physics never breaks the rules, unless the place itself is wrong. I tried telling myself, this was an old report, I was overthinking it. But even after closing the laptop, my hands were trembling. That night I didn't go near the basement. I sat upstairs with all the lights on. The house was, as it always had been, not completely silent, but the kind of quiet where you can hear the small sounds. Pipes settling, walls creaking. But I wasn't listening to those. I was listening down. At 2:47 a.m., the sound came again. Not knocking. This time just one sound. A faint scraping, metal on concrete, from below, and with it, complete silence. Not ordinary silence. The kind of silence where something had stopped in the middle and was watching to see if I noticed. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat in the dark, staring at the floor, thinking. Sealed shaft, unknown depth, something breathing on the other side of the wall. And for the first time, I stopped thinking about whether this can be explained. I started thinking about what Gerald Voss had understood that I hadn't yet. I went down to the basement, descending the stairs slowly. Each wooden step gave a muted creak. The air felt different than before, cold, heavy, as if rising from below rather than coming in from outside. I reached the bottom and went toward the shelf. I checked the bolts. At first, everything seemed the same, still anchored, firmly held to the wall. But looking closely, something had changed. Around one bolt, a fresh ring of dust on the concrete, faint but clear, as if someone from inside was slowly trying to turn it loose. I stood there staring for several seconds. Then very gently, I placed my hand on the wall. Cold concrete, completely still. I almost held my breath and pressed my ear against it. At first nothing, just the low hum of the house. Then, a sound, not from far away, right from the other side of the wall. The sound of breathing. Slow, deep, regular. Like someone sleeping. No, like someone pretending to sleep. I pulled back immediately, ran toward the stairs so fast I nearly fell, came up into the kitchen and locked the door behind me. And then I understood, this wasn't a sound anymore. It was something trapped on the other side of the wall, and now slowly finding a way out. Looking at the basement shelf, I saw one bolt had gone loose. Not all the way, but I could turn it with my fingers. The threaded part gleamed faintly in the dim basement light. Around it, a fresh circle of dust. I quickly checked the rest. Another bolt was in the same state, slightly loose, the ring of dust around it even wider, meaning the shelf was slowly separating from the wall, by tiny fractions, millimeter by millimeter. I couldn't stop myself. The next day I bought the strongest bolts from the store in Black Hollow. A drill, masonry bits, everything. Back at the house I drilled new holes in the concrete beside the old ones, and put in 4 more bolts on the shelf. 8 total now. While drilling, a vibration was spreading through the concrete, and strangely, it felt like it was being felt from the other side too. No knock, no sound, just a pressure, like something on the far side was pushing back. The more I tightened the bolts, the more my hands hurt, but the shelf now didn't move at all, like it had become one with the concrete, held by 8 anchors. That evening, I sat on the porch, looking out at Boss Lake. The last light was slowly fading. That's when I called Brenda. "Brenda, be honest with me," I said. "What's behind that shelf in the basement?" Silence on her end. A long silence. The distant sound of the TV was audible. "Daniel," she finally said, "why do you need to know this?" "Because it's moving," I said. "The bolts are coming loose. Something is pushing from the other side." Another silence, heavier this time. Then she said, "Don't open anything." I stopped. "What?" "Whatever is there. Leave it exactly as it is." "You know what's there?" I asked. A moment of quiet. Then very softly, "I only know Gerald kept it sealed." And then the call dropped. On the night of October 29th, the knocking started again. But this time something had changed. It started around midnight, even earlier, and the sound was louder, heavier. Not just a knock, but an impact that went through the floor, the walls, everything, and hit you in the chest. And the most unsettling thing was, it knew how to count. It picked up from where it left off. 31, 32, 33. The same interval between each sound, the same patience. I was sitting up in bed, back against the wall, knees drawn to my chest, and against my will I was counting. 40, 41, 42. At 50, the knocking stopped. And then the voice began. The same hollow, breathless voice, completely mechanical. 51, 52, 53. It kept going. 54, 55, 56. I was listening, completely frozen. My body wouldn't move, only numbers rising in my head. 60, 70, 80, and then 88. It stopped here. A long silence fell. I sat there trembling, waiting, but nothing else came. It stopped at 88. I didn't sleep that night. Sat until dawn, looking at the camera feed. The basement door completely still. Nothing moving, just a dark door and a dark kitchen. But the next morning when I went down to the basement, 2 new bolts had come loose. Not the old ones, the new ones. The ones I had drilled in and installed just 3 days ago. And on the wall beside the shelf, right beside it, new marks in the concrete. Scratches, faint but clear. A number, 88, as if it was keeping records, writing its own progress on the wall, as if it wanted to show me how close it was getting. I couldn't understand where it was trying to reach. But I understood one thing. The counting and the bolts were moving together. Every number brought it closer to the wall. And whatever was on the other side of the wall was waiting, patiently. For Gerald Voss, this had been going on 30 years. He'd reinforced the wall, put in bolts, tried to contain it. But Gerald was gone now, and the counting had started again. I started sleeping in my car. Not because the car was safe, it wasn't, truthfully. But it had become impossible to stay inside the house at night. The sound was no longer confined to the basement. It had spread through the whole structure. The floor would vibrate, the walls would hum, and even when there was no knocking, the house didn't feel empty. It felt like something inside, something large, had worn the whole building like a skin and was moving beneath it. From inside the car, in that open clearing where the house stood, even looking at it from outside, I could hear the sound at night, the distant knocking, and above all of it, the counting, 89, 90, 91. It never stopped. It didn't stop and start over. It continued from exactly where it had left off the night before. Every morning I'd go inside and see another bolt loose, another number carved on the wall. I stopped going to the basement because I didn't want to see anymore. But I knew what was happening. On November 3rd, I drove into town again. The man was on the bench, same place, same cab. I sat beside him and told him everything. The knocking, the voice, the bolts, the numbers, the wall, all of it. He never interrupted me, just listened, looking down the road. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he asked, "How far has it gotten now?" 112, I said, as of last night. He let out a slow breath. Gerald managed to hold it at 67 for almost 10 years, he said. Every morning he'd go down and tighten the bolts. That was his life. He'd tighten them, then wait for the night. He looked at me. And every night, he said, it would undo whatever he'd fixed. Then he added, as if it was learning how much effort it takes to keep something closed. But it stayed, I said. The man nodded slowly. Yes, he said, it did. Then after a pause, and the problem is, it was never just a sealed thing. I looked at him. He kept his eyes on the road as he spoke, as if the story was flowing through the empty space of the street rather than directly at me. When Howard Voss bricked it up, he said, he thought he was stopping the problem. But what he was really doing was giving it a place to wait. I asked, wait for what? He said very softly, to be heard. A heavy silence settled. Then he spoke again. Gerald told me once that counting isn't just numbers. It's a calculation, but not of numbers, of people. I went still. People? Yes, he said. Your movements, your voice, your breath. Everything that reaches the other side of the wall, it keeps count of. I felt my throat dry up. He slowly turned and looked at me. And when that calculation completes, he paused. Then the door opens. I asked, "What calculation?" He shook his head. Gerald didn't know, or if he did, he wouldn't say, but he said it grows faster when you're inside the house and slows when you're outside. I could feel my hands going cold. He said again, "That's why he used to come here at 3 in the morning, to be outside the house, so fewer things would be counted." I slowly asked, "And what happens when the door opens?" The man looked at me, his eyes tired but very steady. "Howard Voss was the man," he said, "the first one to find that shaft, in the 50s. He bought the land knowing it was there." He paused. "People said he was searching because he'd heard stories about what had been found beneath that mine." I was listening with held breath. He cleared the land, built the house, and one day he accidentally broke the seal. I quietly asked, "And then?" The man said very softly, "Then he sealed it back up. With bricks, with plaster. He built a wall, and right at that spot in the basement, he put the shelf, as if nothing had ever been there." Then he added, "But it was. It was. And whatever was down in the depths of that mine shaft, or whatever it was connected to, it had started counting from that moment. First, Howard heard it, then Gerald, after Howard died, and now you." "What was down there?" I asked. "I don't know," he said. "Gerald didn't know. Howard probably didn't know either. And maybe that's the worst part." He paused, eyes on the road. "They never managed to reach the bottom. That's what the old mining report said. The shaft kept going down, and at some point the workers noticed their own echoes weren't coming back." Something inside me went cold at those words. "The sound didn't return," he said again, "like you're shouting into something, but it's giving nothing back, just empty." I sat in silence. "Then it started counting," I said. He nodded. "Howard heard it first, then Gerald, then you." "What do I do?" I asked. He was quiet for a long time. "Gerald's method was the bolts," he said. "Every morning he'd tighten them, but he never added new ones." "Why not?" I asked. "Because new bolts mean you're reacting," he said, "and anything that reacts becomes part of the count." That thought settled heavily in my mind. He said, "And don't listen. That was the most important rule." "I can't help it," I said. "Once it starts, my head automatically counts along. 1, 2, 3. He stopped. "That's the bad part," he said. "Why?" "Because then you're not just listening," he said. "You're keeping rhythm with it." I went cold. "You're becoming part of its rhythm," he said. And Gerald believed, once that happens, it doesn't just count you anymore. It uses you. I felt my throat constrict. "How much time do I have?" I asked. He let out a slow breath. "Howard had a few years," he said. "About 5. He reset twice." "Reset?" "New concrete, resealing. Every time you reset, it goes back to 0. He paused. "But it doesn't stay at 0. He looked at me. "It remembers the way up." I fell silent. "And Gerald?" I asked. "He never reset," he said. "He just kept it contained, with bolts and his own discipline. Years of not listening." I nodded. "I can't do that," I said. "I hear it even when it's not there." He said very quietly, "Then leave." The words were simple, but heavy. "If I leave," I asked, "what happens to it?" "The count continues," he said, "but slowly, much more slowly." "And if I never come back?" He was quiet for a long time. "Then it will finish without you," he said. "And when it finishes, the door will open." He looked down the road. And what was counting, he said softly, will emerge to find whoever it's been counting all this time. Looking, Gerald's father said that's what happened to the 1919 mining crew, the ones who first got close to the thing below. They sealed the shaft and left. Then one by one, over a few years, they started to disappear. Not all at once, not dramatically. They just were no longer anywhere. Their families filed missing reports, but not one of them was ever found. I drove back toward the house. I don't know why, habit, or that refusal to accept reality that had kept me there all this time. Or something worse, which the old man on the bench had communicated without saying. The counting wasn't just tracking me, it was binding me. With each number, a connection was forming between me and whatever was in the depths of that shaft. A pull, downward. I could feel it, not just hearing but sensing it. A pull, very faint but constant, toward the basement, toward the wall. That evening, I decided I'd go down to the basement one more time. I wanted to see how loose the bolts had gotten. If it was very bad, I'd leave. And if there was still time, I'd tighten them again, like Gerald did. At 7 in the evening, I went down. Outside, there was still light, but inside the basement, that light means nothing. A pale bulb hung overhead. Looking at the wall, I immediately knew something had changed. The numbers, far more than before. And now they were no longer in straight lines, scattered, layered over each other. Large, small, pressed, jagged, as if someone was writing in frantic haste. 147. I counted. 147 was the largest number. I looked at the bolts. All 8 were there. But every single one was loose. The slightest pressure made them shift. The shelf itself was slightly pulling away from the wall. I picked up the wrench, started working. The moment I set the wrench on the first bolt, something changed. Not a sound, not a knock, a vibration, deep, heavy, one I felt in my teeth, inside my skull, even in my very breath. The wall was shaking, the whole wall. I didn't stop working, kept tightening, second bolt, third. But then it wasn't just vibration anymore. A heat. The wall was becoming warm, as if something on the other side was pressing. Fourth bolt, fifth. And then a feeling inside my head became clear. I was not alone. I didn't look behind me. Just as I was reaching for the 6th bolt, the voice started. 100. I froze. The voice was clearer than before. Closer. More real. 48. 149. 150. I tightened the 7th bolt. My hands were shaking. The wrench slipped once, then twice. The dust around the anchors was hot and gritty on my fingers. 151. I reached for the 8th bolt, the last one. And right at that moment, the voice stopped. Silence. The whole basement went absolutely still. No wall vibration, no heat. As if everything switched off at once. I stood there, wrench in hand. And then I heard the breathing. Not from the other side of the wall. Behind me. Slow, deep, regular. The same breathing I'd heard through the wall before. But now it was no longer on the other side. It was in the room with me. I've never been so afraid in my life. My body completely locked up, fingers gripping the wrench, at the back of my nose, at the back of my neck. That breath, hot and damp, right up close. I didn't turn around. Not at all. Gerald's words were in my head. Don't listen. Don't respond. This was more than listening. This was a presence. I slowly tightened the 8th bolt. Once, twice, 3 times. The breathing stayed at the same distance. I placed the wrench on the shelf. Then I didn't turn back. Walked straight toward the stairs. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. The breathing followed me. Same distance, same rhythm. I climbed the stairs. The wood creaked and shuddered. The breathing climbed with me, reached the kitchen, crossed the threshold. And right at that moment, the breathing stopped. Right before the threshold, I turned and looked. The basement stairs descended into darkness. The light was on, and now it wasn't. Nothing visible below. But I knew something was still down there. Still there, watching. I closed the door, latched it, and dragged the kitchen table in front of the door. I stood there, table behind me, door in front, and a muffled silence throughout the whole room, as if something was holding its breath. I didn't sleep all night, sat with every light on, staring at the door. It didn't move, but I knew whatever it was hadn't left. In the morning, I started gathering my things. Not slowly, not carefully, just the essentials. Laptop, phone, some clothes, wallet, everything into the car. Left everything else. Because by then I understood this was no longer a home. I shut the door. The sound of locking it felt so loud, as if the whole house was reacting. The TV was still on, blue light flickering on the walls. 152. I stopped dead. It wasn't coming from anywhere outside, not the corridor, not the TV. It was inside the room. 153. I slowly got out of bed. My legs weren't cooperating properly, but I checked the bathroom, the wardrobe, behind the curtains, everywhere. Nothing. The room was empty, but the voice was not. 154. I pressed my ear against the wall. No sound from any adjacent room, no hotel noise, just my own breathing. And mixed in with it, another breath, one that wasn't mine. I stepped back. My hands were cold. The TV sound suddenly seemed very far away, as if it were no longer in my room but in some other world. And then I understood. It hadn't found me. It hadn't let me go either. It had simply come along. 155. It was no longer coming from outside. It was coming from inside me. Not my own voice, not my thoughts. It felt like it was rising from somewhere inside the body, through the bones, through the chest, echoing through the skull. As if the counting wasn't just something heard, it had made a connection between me and the shaft, a thread inside the body, one I hadn't even felt until now, and now it was starting to pull. That night it reached 160, then stopped. I couldn't understand what was happening. It was no longer in the house. It was no longer far away. I was becoming it. The next night it started again. 161. I started speaking out loud. Said whatever came to mind. Songs, names, countries, numbers, sentences. Trying to drown out the sound, but the voice didn't stop. It continued beneath my words, as if my speech was no obstacle to it at all. 162? Like tinnitus. Screaming won't stop it. I started counting backwards. 3, 2, 1. 3, 2, 1. But the horrifying thing, it accepted that too. My backwards numbers became part of its rules. As if instead of stopping it, I was becoming part of it. I stopped. 168. I don't know what the final number is. 200? 500? More? But I could feel it wasn't just growing. It was catching me. A few days later, I called Brenda again. She didn't answer. The office said she was on leave, and they were no longer handling the property. I called Paul Voss again. This time he answered and said, "Stop calling me." Not fear in his voice, but exhaustion. I told him about the basement, the shaft, the counting. He went quiet. then said he knew everything. His uncle had told him everything. About the shaft, about the count, about the bolts. And then what he said next changed everything. Howard Voss, whom everyone said was dead, had not actually died. He had gone down into the shaft. When the count finished, when the door opened, then the basement was empty. The shelf had been moved. There was an opening in the wall, as if the concrete had been torn away. And below, only darkness. His uncle had sealed it again. New concrete, new wall, new bolts. And then it had started again. Paul said the last words very calmly. It never ends. It only resets. And I understood. I was not just in a house. I was inside a cycle. And perhaps this time I wasn't just listening. I was the next name. And the count reset? From 0, Paul said, but much faster than before. Gerald said what had taken his father's count 20 years to reach. After the reset, it got there in under a year. Every time it resets, it changes. It learns. It adapts. My throat had dried up. What was Howard's count? A few seconds of silence on the phone. Then he said, 212. The number hit something inside my chest. For 4 years, Howard held it at 212. Then one night, Gerald heard his father get out of bed. Gerald was young then, still living in that house. He heard Howard slowly walking toward the basement door. Then the door opened. Then the sound of descending footsteps. He paused. Then nothing more. I whispered, 212. For Howard, Paul said, Gerald's threshold was different. He never found out what his final number was, because he spent his whole life keeping the count below that limit. I said nothing, just breathing on both ends of the phone. Gerald said the count is different for every person, Paul continued. It measures you, all the sounds of your existence, your footsteps, your breath, your heartbeat, everything. He called it resonance. And when it gets your full count, then the door can open. Only for you, my hands were going cold. So, what's my number? Paul didn't laugh. He just said, no one knows their own number. That's the terror of the whole thing. I was sitting in the motel room darkness. The TV was playing, but the sounds felt distant. I'm not in the house, I said, but I can still hear the counting. A long silence this time. Then he asked, where are you now? Lexington, a motel. And you're still hearing it? Every night. Now at 168. Long quiet on the other end. When Paul spoke again, his voice was lower than before. Gerald never went too far from the property, he said. Exactly for this reason. He was afraid if the count traveled too far, distance would stop mattering. A pressure built in my chest. You mean? The connection has been established. He said it slowly. You are now tuned to it. The air in the room suddenly felt heavy, like the walls were slowly closing in. So what do I do? You could go back, Paul said. Tighten the bolts, the way Gerald did. For the rest of my life? Gerald did it for 30 years. Gerald is dead. But the count didn't take him. That sentence stopped me. Paul said quietly. He died of a stroke, a natural death. The count couldn't take him. He fought every day, and in the end got an ordinary death. More than his father. I closed my eyes. Thought of a man who went up every morning and tightened bolts. Every night heard his own number coming from the other side of the wall. Knew that deep in the basement wall, in the depths of a bottomless shaft, something was waiting for his count to finish. A man who gave his whole life to this fight. Is there no other way? I asked. Gerald spent 30 years searching, Paul said. Concrete, steel, ceiling, tried everything. Every time it came back, faster, Why didn't he destroy the house? He tried to. I heard Paul let out a slow breath. Once he rented an excavator. He was going to dig around the shaft and fill the whole thing with concrete and gravel. But after 6 feet down, the ground started changing. Changing? First it got hot, then hotter. Then the excavator started sinking. A chill went through me. Like the ground was softening, not solid, something else. I looked around the motel room. An ordinary room. Bed, TV, yellowish lamplight. But suddenly everything felt wrong. As if somewhere in the world there was a wound, and I was tied to that wound. Paul! Even my own voice sounded strange to me. What happens when the count finishes? Such a long silence fell on the other end that I thought the line had cut. Then he said very softly, Gerald told me once. The night Howard went below, Gerald was standing at the top of the basement stairs. The shelving unit opened by itself. And the wall, he paused. The wall wasn't there. My heartbeat was so loud I felt like the phone could hear it. The concrete wasn't broken, Paul said. Gone, as if it had never existed. And beyond it, the shaft was visible. Dark? No. That single word made my body go cold. Gerald said there was light in the shaft. Pale, rising up from below. Like the light you see in the depths of the ocean. Living somehow. I couldn't speak. Howard was standing at the edge of the shaft, Paul said, looking down at that light. Gerald called out to him. Howard turned around. Then Paul said something that froze me solid. He was smiling. He wasn't afraid? No. Paul's voice was shaking now. Gerald said his father looked calm, so calm, as if after years of carrying something heavy, he'd finally set it down. I closed my eyes, and in my head the counting started again. Distant, far away. 169. Then Howard stepped forward, Paul whispered, and fell into the shaft. I was listening with held breath. Gerald said he heard the falling sound for a long time. A long time. The sound was growing smaller, going further away. But it never stopped. Never hit anything. It just faded away. The phone cover in my hand was crackling. Then the wall came back, Paul said. Concrete. Shelving unit. Everything sealed again. And the count reset. I quietly asked. And then, a few seconds of quiet on the other end. Then Paul said, then Gerald sealed the basement. And for the next 30 years, every single morning he tightened the bolts. Yes, because the other option was falling forever. Quiet voice from the other end. Yes. Then we were both silent for a long time. I was listening to the faint hum of the motel room. A muted cooking competition on TV. Bright lights, smiling faces. A normal human world where the greatest fear was risotto not coming out right. And I was sitting here having heard the story of a bottomless shaft. The next day the journal arrived. Paul had sent it overnight delivery. An old composition notebook. Black and white marble cover. The cheap kind you find in drugstores. But inside was 30 years of fear. The pages were filled with Gerald Voss's small, shaking handwriting. Observations, measurements, theories, and the desperate attempts of a man slowly going mad. I read the whole journal in one sitting, nearly an entire day. The early entries were clinical, cold, detached, like a scientist taking experimental notes. He documented knocking patterns, voice behavior, measured how much the bolt loosened, almost 0.2 millimeters per night. He also tracked the count progression. First decade, average 5 to 7 counts per night. Second decade, 12 to 15. Third decade, over 20. And one line repeated again and again. It counts listeners. The more sound you produce, the more data it receives, and the faster the count runs. After 15 years, the entries began to change. The scientific tone disappeared. Fear replaced it. Pure fear. Gerald wrote about dreams. He'd never told anyone before, but apparently from the beginning he was having them. Falling dreams, but not normal falling. Not the sudden jerk, not the shock of waking up. These were endless falls, slowly descending into darkness. He wrote he was falling in the dream, down, and further. Voices all around, voices above, voices below, everyone counting. He'd look up. The small light at the mouth of the shaft would grow smaller. Then he'd look down and see a pale glow, slowly getting closer. And then he'd realize he wasn't just falling. Something was pulling him downward. The darkness wasn't empty. It was full of hands, hands reaching from the walls. Long, unnaturally thin fingers. Exactly like the handprints seen in the basement window. And those hands weren't trying to stop him. They were guiding him, slowly easing him downward. I noticed my own hands trembling as I read. Then came the worst part. Gerald wrote, he often woke up in the basement, not in bed, in the basement, standing in front of the shelving unit, his hands on the bolts, trying to loosen them. Something collapsed inside my chest. The count wasn't just happening to him. The count was working through him. When he slept, his body became an extension of the shaft's thing. From the other side, the thing would loosen bolts. From this side, Gerald's sleeping body, two sides, together. After learning this, Gerald started tying himself to the bed every night. The journal detailed the full system, ropes, clips, knots. Every night he'd bind himself to the bed for 15 years, and every morning his wrists were covered in bruises. Because in his sleep, his body pulled toward the basement. Every night, for 15 years. I closed the journal after reading that section, went to the bathroom, and vomited. I came back and read the last entries. The final year's writing, handwriting trembling, sentences short, scientific detachment completely gone. In its place, only exhaustion, spiritual exhaustion. A man who had fought an invisible war for 30 years and was spent. The last entry was, I am tired. Tonight the count is 196. I have tightened the bolts every morning for 31 years. My hands shake now. My back aches. Some mornings I can barely grip the wrench. I have given my life to this fight. And the fight is not over. And it will never be over. And I am tired. I stared at those lines for a long time. Then the final paragraph. And that was what frightened me most. Gerald had written, once he had thought about just letting the count finish. Just this once. Wondered what it would feel like to stop fighting. Walk down the stairs, see that light, and step forward. Fall forever. He wrote, Howard looked peaceful at the last moment, as if after years of bearing a heavy burden, he'd finally set it down. But Gerald hadn't, because he understood. The count wouldn't end with him. If I fall, my voice joins the choir, and the choir would be louder, faster, stronger. And one day, another person, standing in this basement, would hear the first knock, and waiting for them would be all our voices. I cannot add my voice to that chorus. I will not. So I tighten the bolts. And tomorrow morning, I will do it again. Whoever finds this journal, the count is different for you. Your number is not my number. My total was 224. I know this because the day the count reached 224, the wall began to glow. The same pale light Gerald saw behind the concrete the night Howard descended. But I tightened the bolts. I pressed the shelving unit against the wall with my own body. The light pressed from the other side, and I held from this side. Then the count passed 224. and the light faded. But the count did not stop. It kept going. I had passed my total. The door tried to open. I kept it closed. The count moved past my number. I don't know what that means. I don't know if 224 will come again, or if my number has changed. But I understood one thing. The total is not absolute. It can be resisted. The door can be held closed. Bolts are not the only barrier. You are also a barrier. Your refusal is the barrier. The count will finish. The door will open. Even then, you can say no. Remember this. If you remember nothing else from this journal, remember this. You can say no. I closed the journal, then sat in the motel room thinking of Gerald Voss, a man I'd never met, but who had spent 31 years in a house built over a bottomless hole, tying himself to the bed every night, tightening the bolts every morning, and fighting something that never tired, never stopped, never gave up. A man who, even when he reached his own total, stood before the wall and said no. I thought of Howard Voss too, who didn't say no, who looked at that light, felt peace, then stepped forward, and fell. Still falling. Somewhere in the dark, his voice now part of the choir. Counting, counting, counting. I thought of the 1919 mining crew, of Brenda Halsey, now on personal leave, of Ruth from the general store who said, get a landline, and just in case, and the man on the bench who knew more than he said. And lastly, I thought of myself, the voice in my chest, the vibration in my bones, the count running through my marrow. Now at 174, growing every night, I had a decision to make. I made it the next morning. I went back. The road to the Voss property was exactly as it had been. Dirt road through the trees, canopy descending overhead, cell signals slowly disappearing. Around the bed, the clearing appeared, and in the middle, the house stood. For just a moment, just one moment, it looked like the real estate listing photos again. A quiet retreat, a small, peaceful home, but the windows were still dark. All of them, even in the midday sun. I parked the car, got out, walked to the front door. The door was unlocked. I hadn't locked it when I ran. Inside was exactly as I'd left it. Coffee mug on the counter, laptop on the kitchen table, and the oak table shoved in front of the basement door. I moved the table, unlatched the door, then went down the stairs. The basement was even colder than before. Something in the air felt different, like the room had been waiting for me. The shelving unit was still standing before the wall. The bolts I'd tightened had gone loose again. All of them. Not fully out, but loose enough that the shelving unit rattled when pushed. Loose enough that the unit shifted. Still anchored, but barely. The numbers on the wall had also continued growing, even while I was gone. Up to 174, exactly as far as I'd heard in the motel. Scratched into the concrete, in an increasingly frantic handwriting. I tightened all the bolts again, as hard as I could, then set up the system, Gerald's journal, my laptop, an external microphone, a notebook. I brought the mattress into the kitchen and placed it in front of the basement door, then built a restraint system like Gerald's, tied a rope to the oven handle and looped it around my wrist. Slip knot, not perfect, but workable. I would not sleepwalk into the basement. Set the microphone to record, set the alarm for 5:30 a.m. Up before the count finished, down to the basement, tighten the bolts, before the next night. Then I waited. First night. Knocking began at 12:07 m. Count started from 100 to 75. Louder than anything before. The floor vibrated, the walls hummed. A glass of water on the nightstand rippled with every knock. 176. The voice. No longer distant. No longer muffled through concrete. It was inside the house now, in the air itself. 177. I didn't count along. I focused only on my breathing, on the rough feel of the rope around my wrist, the feeling of being tied to something real. 178. That night the count went to 193. 21 counts in one session. Faster. The pause between numbers was shorter, maybe 5 seconds, maybe less. Morning, down to the basement. 3 bolts significantly loosened, one nearly half an inch out. I tightened them again. Had breakfast, tried to work. The insurance tickets were routine. I processed them on autopilot, but in my head only the count was running. That night, 194 to 200 to 6, 12 counts, even faster. Next morning, bolts loose, tightened again, routine. That night, 207 to 215, 8 counts, even faster. The count was converging towards something. My number, my total. I could feel it, the way you feel a deadline approaching. A tightening, a pressure. 216, 217, 218. Every night, fewer counts. But each count felt heavier than the last. The knock shook the floor. The voice resonated inside my skull. The bolts loosened faster, and the numbers on the wall were appearing in real time. I could hear the scratching sound from the other side of the concrete. As the numbers were being carved, 219, 220, 221. My time was running out. I could feel it in my body. A heaviness, a pull, as if gravity had increased just for me. My walking felt heavy. My hands moved slowly. Something was pulling me downward, toward the basement, toward the wall, toward the shaft. 234, I whispered. And at that exact moment, the house screamed. It was no ordinary sound, not wind, not creaking wood, not a broken wall. The whole house was screaming at once. The walls shook, the floor shook, even the light flickered strangely. In those 3 or 4 seconds, it felt like reality itself had torn. Something in my body felt like a connection snapping, as if something had been gripping me from inside and had suddenly let go. And then, silence. Not the old silence. The old silence had been fearful, waiting. But this was empty, dead, a completely void silence. I waited. 1 minute, 5 minutes, half an hour, 1 hour. Nothing. No knocking, no voice, no vibration. I slowly went down to the basement. The wall beside the shelf was completely normal, where the numbers had been scratched, all gone. Perfectly smooth concrete, as if nothing had ever been there. I pressed my ear to the wall, only heard my own blood flowing. Nothing, nothing at all. For the first time I truly understood. I was alone, completely alone. I left the house that same day, packed everything into the car, contacted a lawyer, made a decision. No more house on this land, no structure, no residence. As if no one should ever stand on this spot again. The days began to normalize. Sleep, food, work, everything returned to how it was. But one thing remained, a feeling that something still hadn't fully let me go. Like something was still listening. And that's where the story should have ended. But the end isn't here. When I had said 234 and the house had screamed and that connection had broken, I had felt something else inside. Not an emptiness, but an echo. As if something hadn't ended, just stopped, waiting. I first thought it was over. Truly over. No house, no sound, no numbers. All of it cut. The kind of silence that should have been peaceful. But the silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt empty. That first night I spent in the same hotel room. Everything was fine. TV playing, cars outside, the ordinary sounds of human life. I slept. But the sleep didn't end. It broke at exactly 3:14 a.m. because I heard 235. I opened my eyes. The TV was still playing. The room light was fine. The door was closed. Everything normal. But the sound, where had it come from? I sat up. Told myself, hallucination, stress, sleep deprivation. The brain replaying. But then I heard again. 236. This time the sound wasn't coming from outside. Not from inside. It was coming from the middle. As if the very air inside the room was speaking. I went to the bathroom, opened the door, looked in the mirror. My own face, eyes red. But one thing odd, my lips were moving slightly. I hadn't said anything, but my lips were moving, as if the body wasn't mine. I whispered, "It's over." But the reflection in the mirror didn't say it. Its lips moved differently, and very softly said, "It hasn't even started." I stepped back. The mirror light flickered, and for 1 second, I and my reflection were no longer one. We had begun 2 separate countings. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next day, I decided to leave the city. Wherever I went, far away. Away from the sound, away from people, away from my own head. But the problem was, the farther I went, the clearer the sound became. Getting on the bus. 237, in the hotel lobby. 238, on the train. 239. No one was saying it, but it could be heard, as if the whole world had become a counting system. The most terrifying thing was when I realized the sound wasn't coming from outside, wasn't coming from inside. It wasn't forming in my perception. It was, my mind was now only a receiver for that pattern. One night I tried something else. I deliberately thought of different numbers, any random numbers, 891, 437, 12,000. But those numbers were instantly corrupted, as if something was correcting them, as if a silent system inside my mind was saying, "No, not this, not this sequence." And then for the first time, I understood where the real fear was. The count was no longer in any location. The count was no longer a sequence. The count was now language, and language doesn't end. The final night I sat down to write, to finish this story. But when I went to write the end, my hand stopped, because what I was writing on the page, I wasn't writing, it was being written by itself. 240, 241, I dropped the pen, but the writing didn't stop. And then I understood. I was no longer the narrator. I was now only a medium, a place through which the numbers pass. I ran outside, looked at the sky, saw people, everything normal. No one was hearing anything, but I knew they can't hear because the count is never a sound. It's recognition. And the last thing I understood, I had never broken it. I had only created a gap in the sequence. And a gap doesn't mean an end. A gap means waiting. Before sleeping that night, I heard again, very slowly, very close, as if something was leaning into my skull and saying, 245. And this time I was certain. This was no longer the story of a house. This was my story.